It was supposed to be a routine broadcast, a panel discussion on international security, live on Global Affairs Network. Karoline Leavitt, rising Republican star and vocal America First advocate, sat upright in her chair, perfectly framed by the American flag behind her. She smiled confidently, waiting for her moment to speak. Across from her, on a split screen from Ouagadougou, sat President Ibrahim Traoré, calm and unmoved, in olive fatigues with no visible emotion. The anchor wasted no time. Ms. Leavitt, your response to claims that U.S. presence in Africa creates dependency? Karoline leaned forward. Let's be honest, without America, Africa doesn't have the tools to fight terrorism, stabilize governments, or secure its own borders. We've saved lives, built schools, fought extremists. She paused, satisfied with herself. President Traoré should thank us. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just said, "Thank you for what? For military bases we didn't ask for funding tied to ideology, for drone strikes in villages you can't even pronounce?" The anchor stuttered. Leavitt bristled. "We're offering stability, Mr. President." "No," Traoré cut in, voice low but sharp. "You're offering a leash and calling it a shield." The silence in the studio was suffocating. Leavitt composed herself. "Do you honestly believe Africa can defend itself without American intelligence and military aid?" "Yes," he replied. "Because America's presence doesn't secure us. It makes us a target." Then he leaned in, just slightly, just enough. "Tell me, Ms. Leavitt, how many wars has Africa brought to your soil?" No answer. "How many drones have we sent to your sky? How many sanctions have we imposed on your elections?" Her lips parted. Nothing came out. "If security is what you offer, then perhaps we'd be safer without it." Back in the control room, producers whispered, "This wasn't supposed to go viral." Too late. Within an hour, Traoré answered, was trending in 5 languages, because the world had seen something rare. Africa didn't ask. Africa answered. By the time the broadcast ended, the clip had already gone global. TikTok remixes, Twitter quotes, Telegram reposts. Traoré's line, "You're offering a leash and calling it a shield," was everywhere. Even in Washington, aides to Karoline Leavitt exchanged nervous looks. Her camp scrambled to reframe the moment. Strong American leadership is always misunderstood by anti-Western forces, one spokesperson told Fox, but not everyone was buying it. In Nairobi, a university professor tweeted, "Karoline Leavitt's mistake wasn't arrogance, it was assuming that Africa had forgotten how to answer back." In Lagos, a popular podcast played the audio on loop. "Tell me, Ms. Leavitt, how many wars has Africa brought to your soil?" Silence. That silence echoed louder than any argument. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré's cabinet urged restraint. "You've made your point," said one minister. "Don't escalate." But Traoré was calm. "I'm not escalating," he said. "She brought the fight to our doorstep. I simply didn't bow." Back in the U.S., Leavitt scheduled a follow-up appearance, this time on a friendly network. "He's deflecting from Africa's own instability," she said, face stern. "We've been the single greatest force for peace and development on the continent." But she was interrupted by the show's own fact-checker. "Respectfully, Congresswoman, dozens of civilian deaths have occurred in U.S.-backed drone operations in Africa over the past decade." She blinked. That's classified military context, but the audience had heard enough. In Mali, graffiti appeared on a cement wall. "We don't need bullets to speak." In Ghana, student groups planned a forum titled "Security or Subjugation." In Burkina Faso, Traoré gave a short press statement. "We have nothing against the American people, but when their leaders speak, we will no longer remain silent." The next morning, Leavitt's phone lit up with a message from her media advisor. "You tried to speak for Africa. Africa just spoke for itself." Karoline Leavitt was used to controlling the room. On Capitol Hill, in press conferences, in town halls, her voice was sharp, confident, immovable. But this time she was on defense, not because she lost a debate, but because someone outside her system refused to play by her rules. And that, to her, was more dangerous than any armed threat. "He's just trying to score points with radicals," she told her communications team, but one intern hesitated. "With respect, Congresswoman, he didn't sound radical. He sounded grounded." She turned slowly. "You think that was grounded?" The intern didn't answer. Meanwhile, in Africa, something deeper was happening. Traoré hadn't insulted America. He hadn't even raised his voice. What made his words sting was how calm he was. In Senegal, a columnist wrote, "He didn't just reject her message, he rejected her authority to deliver it." In Cameroon, young activists created a campaign with one slogan, "Our land, our terms." At a private fundraiser in Texas, Leavitt tried to pivot. "Africa has great potential, but we can't allow hostile voices to shape the narrative." Someone in the crowd asked, "Is wanting independence hostile?" She fumbled the response. "I mean, anti-American voices, ones that..." The moment went viral again, not because of what she said, because she couldn't say why Africa wanting its own voice made her uncomfortable. In Ouagadougou, Traoré met with students under a mango tree. "Are you worried about backlash?" one asked. He smiled slightly. "There's no backlash when you never leaned on them to begin with." "But she's powerful," another said. "So is a storm," he replied. "But I've never seen a storm change the mountain." Traoré didn't just resist. He made it clear that Africa's silence had never meant agreement, only patience. And that patience had run out. Karoline Leavitt's next move was strategic. She released a polished video titled "Why Africa Still Needs Us." It featured slow-motion clips of American soldiers delivering food aid, teachers volunteering in clinics, girls holding U.S.-donated textbooks. Her narration was smooth. For decades, America has stood with Africa, in war, in disease, in development. Without us, chaos fills the void. But Traoré's people watched in silence. Then they watched again, and again. By the fourth viewing, one Burkina official muttered, "They film themselves helping, but never ask who we were before they arrived." In Nigeria, a political analyst dissected the video on a panel show. "What Karoline Leavitt offers is not partnership, it's permission. America builds, but only if you obey, and if you don't, you're unstable." In Burkina Faso, Traoré was asked for comment. He didn't respond with a statement. He called a press conference, brief, direct. "Africa has never been a blank page, but they treat us like one, as if nothing meaningful existed until they arrived with pen and ink." He paused. "We don't need their permission to exist with dignity." Back in D.C., the pressure was building. Even conservative outlets began asking hard questions. Is America offering aid or authority? Leavitt fired back on a podcast. "I will not apologize for American values." The host pushed gently. "But must others accept your values to receive your help?" She didn't answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because every answer she gave now felt like proof of Traoré's point. Meanwhile, in Bamako, a young student at a protest held up a cardboard sign. "Aid with a condition is just a new colonizer with better PR." And in Dakar, a mural appeared overnight. Traoré standing tall with the words, "We didn't ask for your light, we're not in the dark." Karoline Leavitt was scheduled to speak at the Atlantic Policy Forum, a high-profile event in D.C. where foreign leaders, diplomats, and U.S. policymakers mingled under crystal chandeliers and shared carefully worded applause. She entered confidently, determined to reclaim the narrative. "Let's be clear," she said, voice steady. "Our engagement in Africa has always been rooted in peace, freedom, and mutual respect." Some clapped, but others shifted in their seats. She continued, If we step back, bad actors will fill the vacuum. China, Russia, extremism. That's not speculation. It's reality. The room remained polite, but in the hallway, whispers began. Across the Atlantic, a very different stage was unfolding. Traoré spoke in front of a crowd of farmers, students, and village elders. No podium, no teleprompter, just a dusty microphone and a rising sun behind him. "They say if America leaves, we will collapse," he said. "Then let them leave, and let's prove we won't." The crowd erupted, not because it was scripted, but because it was the first time someone said it aloud. Back in the U.S., a journalist published an op-ed titled, "The Leavitt Doctrine: Stability at the Price of Silence." The piece read, "When a foreign power calls you unstable unless you agree with them, that's not partnership. That's conditional loyalty dressed up as friendship." It was shared thousands of times across both hemispheres. Leavitt's team huddled. Should we offer a moderated debate? Try to get ahead of it? She shook her head. We never negotiate with people who reject American leadership. But by now, it wasn't just leaders rejecting it. It was people. In a refugee camp in Burkina Faso, a mother whispered to a nurse, "I used to be afraid if America left. Now, maybe that's when we begin." The next flashpoint wasn't a speech. It was a leaked email. An internal memo from Karoline Leavitt's office, never meant for public eyes, outlined a strategy to reframe African descent as misinformation backed by rival states. The language was clinical. When figures like Traoré gain traction, we must link their messaging to anti-Western influence campaigns. Avoid direct confrontation. Use think tanks to seed doubts about their legitimacy. When it hit the press, the response was immediate. In Burkina Faso, the government's official account posted just one sentence: "If truth becomes threat, perhaps the threat isn't ours." Across Africa, the memo became a symbol, not just of American overreach, but of something deeper: the fear of a continent that speaks for itself. Leavitt attempted damage control. She appeared on morning TV, smiled tightly. "The memo does not reflect my personal views." But the host cut in. "It came from your chief of staff. That doesn't mean I endorse every phrasing. You endorsed the mindset." That clip, too, went viral. Meanwhile, Traoré remained unmoved. He gave no new interview, no dramatic press conference. He just continued his work, opening new local development hubs, funding regional security from within Africa's own coalitions, not through foreign arms deals. A reporter asked if he planned to respond. "To what?" he said. "To words that already defeat themselves?" In Tanzania, a university auditorium erupted into cheers when a student closed her speech with, "The leash is off, and they're afraid of how far we'll run." And on a campus wall in Accra, someone spray-painted, "She said we needed them." We answered. Karoline Leavitt's advisors begged her to walk it back, not the memo itself, but the posture. "Frame it as a misunderstanding. Show humility," one strategist urged. "You don't have to say you were wrong, just that you're listening." But Leavitt refused. "I don't apologize for defending my country." Still, the ground was shifting, not because of what she said, but because of what Traoré hadn't. He didn't retaliate. He didn't lash out. And somehow his silence kept growing louder. In Kenya, a journalist wrote, "The West thinks silence is surrender, but in Africa, silence can be judgment. And sometimes, it's a sentence." In Senegal, youth groups launched a campaign called We Answered, collecting videos of African voices rejecting the narrative of dependency. One video showed a young woman in a classroom holding a globe. They said we'd be lost without them, but look, we're still right here. Traoré was asked by a French reporter, "Would you consider sitting down with Congresswoman Leavitt?" His response was quiet. "She speaks of stability, but builds it on control. We speak of sovereignty, and we build it on trust. There's nothing to negotiate between those two. In Washington, Leavitt doubled down. I will never be intimidated by foreign leaders who reject American values. But even her allies started looking uncomfortable. One senator, off the record, said, "She's turning a debate into a crusade. That's not foreign policy. That's ego." And still, Traoré didn't respond. He didn't need to, because everywhere from Bamako to Kigali, people were doing it for him. In murals, in speeches, in songs, and in silence. The kind of silence that didn't ask for permission. It demanded recognition. Karoline Leavitt held another press conference, this time flanked by 2 former U.S. generals and a former ambassador to Nigeria. She opened with authority. Africa's future is important to us, but it cannot come at the cost of security. Without American leadership, chaos follows. She expected applause. She got questions. "Whose security?" asked a reporter. "Theirs or ours? Is leadership something you offer or something you demand?" For the first time, Karoline paused. Her voice didn't shake, but it didn't ring out either. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré arrived quietly at a regional summit. No press entourage, no talking points, no American officials. When asked about Leavitt's remarks, he simply said, "I heard them. Do you plan to respond?" "I already did. You just weren't listening the first time." The summit focused on African-led defense pacts, trade frameworks, and joint tech investments, all without Western partners. One headline read, "Africa drafts its own future and doesn't fax it to Washington." In Ethiopia, a parliamentarian remarked, "It's not anti-American, it's post-American." In a cafe in Cotonou, a group of young filmmakers re-edited Leavitt's speech over images of colonized Africa, and then over images of modern African cities rising from their own will. The caption? "We've been building, you just never looked." Back in Washington, a leaked recording caught one of Leavitt's aides whispering, "This isn't just about Traoré anymore. It's about the fact that he never needed our stage to be heard." And in the hills outside Bobo Dioulasso, a boy practicing his French recited a line for his teacher. She spoke, he answered. We listened. "Good," the teacher smiled. "Now say it again, but this time like it was yours." It was a dinner in Brussels, a closed-door meeting of NATO-aligned policymakers and development officials. Karoline Leavitt attended as the unofficial voice of American conservatism abroad. Between bites of sea bass and sips of red wine, the talk turned again to Africa. "We need to realign the narrative," said a French diplomat. "They're not just rejecting aid anymore. They're rejecting us." Leavitt stirred her glass slowly. "Maybe it's time we remind them who makes the rules." An awkward pause followed. Even her allies were growing wary of her tone. That same week, in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood in a university lecture hall filled with law students. No podium, no cameras. "When power demands gratitude," he said, "it's not help, it's hierarchy." He let the silence linger. True partnership doesn't knock with a clenched fist. Across the continent, students, journalists, artists, even mid-level officials had begun to reject not just Western policy, but Western framing itself. They didn't want more development milestones. They wanted sovereign definitions of success. In Mozambique, a podcast host asked, "If America's role is so essential, why do they panic when we imagine a world without it?" Meanwhile, Leavitt's public approval outside the U.S. plummeted. But within far-right circles, she became a symbol, not of diplomacy, but of defiance. She leaned in harder. "This isn't about Africa, it's about whether we let anti-Americanism go unchecked." But that framing collapsed when a Burkinabe journalist asked her, "Is it anti-American to want to stand alone?" She had no answer, because her entire worldview was built on the assumption that being needed meant being right. Traoré never raised his voice. He didn't organize protests. He simply withdrew from negotiations, summits, and frameworks he no longer believed in. And that withdrawal echoed louder than confrontation ever could, because power isn't always taken. Sometimes it's returned. The annual Global Partnership Forum in Geneva opened with fanfare. Flags lined the stage. Delegates smiled for the cameras. Karoline Leavitt was the keynote speaker, again. She stepped up, confident, measured. In uncertain times, one thing remains constant: American leadership. Where we go, freedom follows. Polite applause followed, but it was scattered. Something had shifted. Because across the ocean, in a city without marble floors or polished spotlights, Ibrahim Traoré was standing before thousands, not at a forum but in a field. No teleprompter, just him and his people. They say freedom follows them, he said, but freedom is not a parade, it's a fire, and we light it ourselves. The crowd didn't applaud, they roared. Back in Geneva, reporters asked Leavitt, "How do you respond to the growing wave of African leaders rejecting U.S. aid frameworks?" She offered the same line. Aid is not control, it's compassion. But outside the forum, a protester held up a sign. You can't give what you won't let go of. Traoré, now back in Ouagadougou, released a quiet statement. Africa isn't rising because it's funded. It's rising because it's finished being told what it is. And then, nothing more. No gloating. No final attack. Because the point had already been made. Karoline Leavitt had come to represent more than a country. She had come to represent a mindset. And what she hadn't realized was, the world had learned to outgrow that mindset. And they didn't need permission. In a classroom in Burkina Faso, a teacher wrote one sentence on the board. They said we needed them. We said, not anymore. A student raised their hand. Is that a quote? The teacher smiled. That's history now. She stood on global stages, declaring that Africa needed America. She cited security, aid, stability, and expected gratitude. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't offer gratitude. He offered something far more powerful, a mirror. A mirror that reflected back decades of control dressed as compassion. A mirror that shattered the illusion that help, when conditional, is anything but soft power. And when Traoré answered, he didn't yell, he didn't beg, he didn't negotiate for dignity. He spoke calmly, because when you know who you are, you don't raise your voice. He said, you offer a leash and call it a shield. You bring peace only if we sit still. You call it leadership. We call it control. And for the first time in a long time, Africa didn't just listen. Africa responded. This wasn't about one man or one woman. It was about a continent standing up, not with rage, but with memory and with clarity. And now, the world can no longer pretend Africa doesn't need to be spoken for. It needs to be heard.